Really looking forward to getting started. So I'm Dr. Rollins, and I'm going to introduce Erin Kosloski. Erin's a doctoral student in my lab. She's a third year speech, language, and hearing student. And she's really excited to share her work with you. She graduated from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, with an individualized bachelor degree program. Individualized means that she developed this bachelor degree all by herself, and it was actually very, very rigorous of what she developed. And it was in psycholinguistics and applied to autism, and you're going to really see that influence in her talk today. She also minored in Spanish and psychology, and she has a certificate in intercultural communication. She's been working with autistic children and young adults since 2015, and she's passionate about supporting and advocating for people on the spectrum. So with that, we will let Erin share her. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Rollins. My name is Erin Kosloski, and today I'll be presenting my first year project titled The Relationship Between Joint Engagement and Social Motivation of Language for Young Autistic Children. So I'd like to begin with a note on the terminology I'll be using during this presentation. So there are differing opinions in the field about whether to use person-first language, so saying a person with autism, versus identity-first language, so saying an autistic person. And I will be using identity-first language because that is the preference of many autistic people, including the position statement of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And also, I will be using the term autistic to refer to non-autistic children. There's differing opinions about this as well. Previously, it's commonly been typically developing, but there are some negative associations around that. And then you could use neurodivergent, but that also includes many populations, including ADHD. So autistic is just more specific non-autistic children. So with that being said, let's review the diagnostic criteria for autism according to the APA. So autism is a complex neurodevelopmental condition characterized by two main diagnostic criteria, and those are challenges with social communication and interaction, and the presence of restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. And today we're going to be focusing mainly on challenges with social communication and interaction. So let's talk about what is social communication and what is language. So social communication has both verbal and nonverbal aspects, including eye contact, gestures, and prosody. And what makes something social is using those elements to share emotion, experiences, and information with another person. So we're going to watch an example of that.
Whoa. Oh, what happened? It's happy. Oh. What's that? Oh, so sad.
So we see that this girl is using gestures. So she's showing mom the book. She's coordinating her visual attention from the book to mom and back to the book. Like, are you seeing what I'm seeing? Are you with me here? And she has lots of vocalizations, lots of eye contact, maybe a couple words in there, but mostly it is the other social aspects. Now, it's important to distinguish that using language is not always the same as communicating socially. So you can have language without social communication, and that's something we see a lot in our autistic kiddos. So we're going to watch an example of that. And there's kind of a lot happening in this video, so we're going to play it twice. So the first time, I want you to kind of focus on the clinician. Can you see that? Maybe the clinician. And then the second time, we'll focus on what the kid is doing.
Mom. Why?
Working.
Why? Why?
You want the white blood.
What? What?
So we see that this clinician is scaffolding the interaction as much as she can. She's trying to get him to engage with her by having him request. And let's watch what the child is doing one more time.
Mom. Why?
Working.
Why? Why?
You want the white blood.
What? What?
So clearly this child, he's very smart, he's very persistent, he is locked in on that goal, he's building a tower, and he's requesting the white because he's actually trying to alternate the colors of the pattern, make it the right pattern. However, he is using his language to meet his goals and to request. He's not communicating socially. It's about what am I doing with this tower and not what are we sharing together. He maybe looks at her once, but for the most part, he's looking at the blocks and his own tower. And so we see kind of a clear distinction between the social communication and language without social communication. So let's talk a little bit about the developmental trajectories of both of these things. So for autistic children, the developmental trajectories of social communication and language are intertwined, right? So at approximately 2 months of age, autistic infants begin looking at their parents' faces for longer durations of time. They're smiling, we see the social smile. They start cooing, there's back and forth, proto-conversations. And then between 9 and 12 months, they gain intentional communication, so using those gestures and vocalizations, and then eventually they gain coordinated joint attention. So what we saw with the girl in the book, she's coordinating from the object to the parent back to the object. And by the time they're gaining their first words, they've already achieved all these social communication milestones. And so they already have that foundation of socialness to build their language on top of. However, autistic children, we see there's often a delay and or stall in their social development, and this results in oftentimes a separation between language and social communication. And a lot of autistic kids, as we saw in that other video, actually acquire language without social communication. So as Siddhi talked about last time, autistic kids between 2 and 6 months show a decrease in eye gaze as opposed to an increase. They often do not develop coordinated joint attention or use it much less than autistic children. However, they're very good at fast mapping. So they often gain vocabularies and they can label objects really well. They have a lot of, not always a lot, but they can have a lot of language. But again, it's about, are they integrating that language into social interactions for the purpose of sharing with their parents? So let's talk about some of the most commonly used language measures in research and intervention. One of the main types is parent report measures, and one of the most widely used we see is the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, or the MCDI. And this is essentially a vocabulary checklist that gives a bunch of words and asks parents whether their child says that word or not. And although the MCDI does have strengths, it also has several limitations, especially for use with autistic children. So for example, studies have found that parents of autistic children don't always feel confident when completing these checklists. They think their kid might say the word sometimes, but not consistently. So do I say yes? I don't really know. Up to 15% of responses by parents of autistic children were actually inconsistent across 2 versions of the MCDI in one study. And so this kind of raises some concerns about how accurately these are capturing autistic children's language skills. And additionally, those are the studies, they do not distinguish social communication from non-social language. And in particular, it's not distinguishing the context of the word usage. So the parent might report that, okay, my kid says 25 of these words, but if all of those words are colors, animals, cars, like that they use for their toys and books to label, because again, they're good at labeling and that fast mapping, but they're not integrating those words into conversations, we don't really get that information from this kind of measure. Another common type of measure is standardized assessment. So here we have one example, which is the preschool language scales, the infamous bear, the PLS, and these also have some limitations for autistic children. So one is that they're often conducted somewhere like here, right? In the clinic, they come in with an unfamiliar clinician, an unfamiliar location, and they're being asked a lot of demands. And so this can induce anxiety for autistic kiddos. And in addition, there's a lot happening in these tests, right? So it's attentional demands. They have to comprehend what you're asking me to do, executive functioning to follow instructions. And so some studies have shown that autistic children score at floor on these standardized assessments, but then they'll do better in a naturalistic context. So again, that gets to, are we really capturing their true abilities in these kind of assessments? And again, these kinds of assessments are rarely examining social language. So we see here all the toys and materials that are involved in this test. And these kinds of tests are a lot of labeling the objects, interacting with the test materials, and there's less of a need or inclination to interact with the person. And so again, we're not capturing whether or not they're using their words socially. In contrast, an alternative that is gaining traction in the field is naturalistic interactions. And so this is called natural language sampling. So you essentially record a naturalistic interaction of a child interacting with either a parent or a clinician. And then once you have that recording, it's really advantageous because you can measure multiple aspects of language. You can go back and recode the data. This is what Dr. Rollins is the queen of, like go back and recode it for all these things. We can get MLU, we can get their word count, we can get, importantly, their pragmatics, all from one interaction. And additionally, we can characterize the context of what's happening around when the kid says that word, which is what I was mentioning you're not getting necessarily from the parent report or the standardized assessments. Okay, and one of the ways we can characterize interactional context is using engagement states. So Bakeman and Adamson first coded engagement states in 1984, and they characterized several states, which we see here, ranging from less social to more social. And we'll talk more about the specifics in a little bit in my methods, but the point I want you to see here is that these are developmentally ordered, moving from when a child is completely unengaged with the other person to when they have really awesome social attention, like we saw with that little girl in the book and her mom. So we're going to look at two examples. So the first is object engagement. The kid isn't really talking, mom's talking, but. So you see here, he is, again, locked in on the ball. He's playing with the ball. Mom is there. She's trying to get him to give her something, but he is kind of doing his own thing right now. So he is object engaged. This is not a social type of engagement state. In contrast, we have this example of coordinated joint engagement. So they're playing together, they're going back and forth, they each take a couple turns. You see lots of great eye contact. She's coordinating the ball to mom and back to the ball. And so we see just kind of a wide range of both playing with the ball, what this different kind of engagement can look like. So some previous findings using engagement states have found that on average, perhaps not surprisingly, autistic children spend very little time in the coordinated or the more social engagement. And in this study, Adamson et al., they found that autistic kids spent just 5% of the interactions in coordinated joint engagement compared to the autistic children who spent 16% of their interaction in that state. And additionally, there have been a few studies, not too many, but a few that look at the relationship between joint engagement and language in autistic children. And they have found that time spent in certain types of supported joint engagement, which is kind of an in-between somewhat social state, related to later language outcomes. However, the way they measured that was they recorded interaction at time 1 and characterized their joint engagement from that. And then at time 2, they did a standardized assessment, and they were looking at a correlational relationship between the two. So that's great. We want to improve vocabulary. But again, they were using a standardized assessment. So that brings us back to all the limitations that I was just mentioning with those. You're not capturing the social elements of that. And so there was still a gap in the literature regarding examining the relationship between different types of engagement and the language produced by autistic children in a single interaction, and whether they're using that language to communicate socially. So that brings us to our research questions. So our first question was how much time and how much language autistic children produce in various types of engagement. And we hypothesized that autistic children would spend most of their time in these less social engagement states because they often prefer playing with objects to interacting with people. We also predicted they would talk more in the less social states because, again, they're good at labeling objects, they have that fast mapping skill, and they may be less overwhelmed by the social stimuli. Yes. And then for our second question, we were asking, is there a relationship between time spent in more social engagement and production of more social language? We hypothesized that yes, there would be a positive relationship between children spending time in those more social engagement states and using their language to communicate socially, because there's an overlap in skills needed to participate in social engagement and to communicate socially, such as that joint attention that I keep talking about. So on to our methods. The current study was a secondary analysis of data from families who participated in a broader study by Rollins and DeFroy in 2023. And during that larger study, they collected a bunch of data on generalized measures and parent-child interaction videos. But in Rollins and DeFroy, they focused on the generalized measure. And so for this, we used the 47 autistic kids and parents from that study who had parent-child interactions recorded, because that's what we wanted to look at. And to characterize the sample a little bit, so on average, the child's age was 36 months, so right around 3 years. This sample was cognitively and linguistically delayed on average with high levels of autism symptomatology. So we have here the autism diagnostic and observational scales, the social subset, and the total score. This is their calibrated severity score, so just their overall score. And for that test, a score of 8 indicates high levels of autism symptomatology. So we see that for both their social and their total scores, they're at that 8 on average. And then finally, their nonverbal IQ, that's from the Mullen Scales of Early Learning, and that's a test with a mean of 100, standard deviation of 15. So we see this average of 60. They're significantly cognitively delayed. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as we get to the discussion section. Okay, so the procedures for the study. As I mentioned, we used 10-minute naturalistic parent-child interactions. Those videos were recorded in the home by a clinician holding an iPad. So that was this first stream of video here. This girl looking fabulous in her sunglasses. And then the parents wore hidden camera eyeglasses with a little camera in the middle. So that we see here at the bottom, this is what lost my mouse. This is what the parent is seeing. And that's really useful for us to get a better view of whether the child is actually looking at the parent's face. And so for that, research clinicians came, they're here right now, came to the family's home and we brought a bag of toys, a standard set of toys across our participants. Parents were given that bag and told to play with their child as they normally would. And then the videos were transcribed and coded using the computerized language analysis or CLAN software. We see here a screenshot of the transcription and some of the codes that we used. And then I coded those for 2 measures, which we're going to talk about now. So it's just a reminder of the engagement states we talked about before. We used an adaptation of these states. I'm going to break them down a little bit. So this is an overview of graphics of all the possible engagement states in my coding system. But for this presentation, we're going to focus on the states highlighted in orange. And those were the ones that gave the child an opportunity to show advanced social behavior and language. And so I'm going to talk about each one. So in these graphics, the solid purple line indicates someone acting on the object. And so on the left, we have object engagement. This is the most basic. We saw that example with the ball. I'm going to give examples of playing with blocks to try to differentiate the states. So this would be the child playing with blocks, doing his own thing independently. Mom is sitting there, but not playing with him. In these next 2 states, we have lower and higher supported joint engagement. So what differentiates lower and higher is whether there was cooperation, reciprocity, a shared goal between the 2. And supported joint engagement, we see now that, okay, mom is also acting on the object, but because it's lower, there's no shared goal between them. So in the block example, mom and child may both be building their own towers. They're both playing with the blocks, but they're not cooperating together. In contrast, in higher supported joint engagement, they now both have a role in the same activity. So this would be if mom and child are taking turns building a tower together. Is that distinction making sense? Okay. And then in contrast, we get to the more socially complex states, which are lower and higher coordinated engagement. And we see here this really exciting thing of we're bringing eye contact into it. So the dotted lines, I don't know if you can tell it's dotted, but that is visual attention between the 2. So in lower coordinated, again, lower meaning there's not cooperation between them, but now it's coordinated. So the child is making eye contact. So this would be back to parent and child building their own towers, but the child is checking in and making attention, visual coordinated attention with mom. And so that's a step up. And then finally, we have the big one, the most social, higher coordinated engagement. So we see the child is coordinating visual attention. There's a joint goal between them, so they have those roles. And now the child and parent, because they're cooperating and they have the visual attention, they each have their own perspective. And so that's what differentiates this dark purple. The child is coordinating not only the visual attention, but also recognizing I have my own perspective in this interaction and cooperation, and the parent does too, and I have to navigate both of those things. And we see that's like the full, most social state that we have. Okay, so that was,
The kids have that right too.
yes, yes. Yeah, that's an early skill for our autistic kids. That's something our autistic kids struggle with a lot, as you will see in the results. So the second coding scheme, we created a novel coding scheme for social motivation of language based on the child's attention to the adult and their communicative intention for each utterance. So we're going to break down this table a little bit. We have 4 different components of what makes something social, increasing in complexity from left to right. So on the left, we have just auditory attention with a response. So this is the most basic element of an interaction. Essentially, this would be if I'm over here playing, I'm the child, mom asks me a question and I answer the question, but I don't look towards her. So I know that at least you're talking to me, you're asking me a question, I'm going to respond, but I'm not turning to you, I'm not adding anything else to that. So that's the most basic side here. And then increasing in complexity, we have visual attention to the adult. So that's if I'm saying something and I turn and look at, it could be either the adult's body or the adult's face. We didn't want to mandate eye contact because that is hard for our kids, but it's at least showing that directionality to the adult in contrast to just the auditory attention. And then in the middle here, we have sharing information not prompted by a question. So here, this was essentially responding to questions, but this is a step up in the conversational level. So this would be if the adult made a statement to me and I'm going to make a statement back and I'm building on that conversation. I'm showing that I'm paying attention to you. I'm not just answering a question because I have to answer a question. I'm continuing that interaction. And then finally, these were all worth 1 point, and there can be kind of any combination of those things gets you the score. This is worth 2 points because it's kind of the most important. And this is what we were seeing with that dark purple coordinated attention. So it's monitoring, influencing the adult's visual attention. That's kind of the highest level skill. That would be most often what I saw was the child saying, "Mommy, look," and then with a point. So it's, again, I know that I'm looking at something, you're looking at your own thing, but I want you to look with me. And so that level of influencing attention. And so based on the combination of what elements an utterance had, it got the score ranging from 4 all the way down to 0. You may notice 0 is gray all the way across. So that means that it's completely non-social. It doesn't even have this auditory attention. It's really just essentially labeling an object, the child saying something, but there's no evidence of it being social communication. Okay, so that was a lot. So what are the actual dependent variables of my study? We had the number of seconds in each engagement state, and we used CLAN to calculate that. We also got the verbosity in each engagement state from those transcripts, and we used words per minute in each engagement state. And then finally, for social motivation of language, we used the frequency of utterances that got each social motivation score, so ranging from 0 up to 4 points. Okay, to the results. So here we have box plots of the time spent and words per minute in each engagement state. And just, I know everyone's seen a box plot, but it might have been a while, so let's just break this down a little bit. So on the y-axis, we have the time spent in seconds. Remember, they were all 10-minute interactions, so a maximum of 600 seconds total. On the x-axis, we have the engagement states, those 5 that were highlighted in the orange boxes that we talked about. And then we have the median words per minute in that engagement state. We used median because the data was highly skewed for their language. So a lot of kids didn't talk at all or talked very little. And so we thought median was a more appropriate measure than mean, because the mean would have been 0 for most of them. So, and then on top, we have the number of children who spent any time in that state at all. So we see that, remember, there were 47 children, so 46, almost everyone, spent at least some time in the object engagement, and then 45 in this lower supported engagement, but then those numbers go down. And then real quick, this thick line in the middle is the median. We have the maximum, minimum, 25th percentile, 75th percentile, and then the little stars and dots are outliers. So these were our non-social states, remember, object and the lower supported engagement. We saw that most kids spent time in those states. They spent more time in those states, and on average, they talked more during those states. Notably, both of these are still less than 1. So like I said, the kids weren't talking a lot, but they were higher compared to what we saw in our social states, where almost only half spent time in them. They're much lower in their number of seconds. And for 2 of them, they talked an average of 0 words per minute. Here we have another box plot. This one is the frequency of the utterances with each social motivation score. So the green chart we talked about. And here we have the frequency and each point value. So we see that most of the utterances scored 0 points. So again, gray all the way across, none of the elements of social communication. And then as we increase in each point value, the frequency decreases. And by the time we get to 3 and 4, it was maybe like 3 or 4 kids who used those at all. And so because of that, we were actually unable to include 3 and 4 point utterances, in our correlational analysis. Okay, speaking of correlational analysis, so we use Kendall's tau correlations, which are non-parametric correlations. And we did that for the same reason we used medians, because the data was highly skewed, and this was a more appropriate measure for that. So we found that there was a medium magnitude positive relationship between time spent in object engagement and frequency of 0 point utterances, and a medium magnitude positive relationship between time spent in lower coordinated joint engagement and the frequency of 2 point utterances, so those somewhat social utterances. So what does all this mean? I put the box plot up just for reference. So as we said, autistic children spent less time in and talked less on average during the social engagement states. And that was in keeping with the previous findings that they're spending very little time in the coordinated joint engagement. And as we predicted, they're talking less in these social states. Additionally, most of their language was not used to communicate socially. So most of it was these 0 point and then 1 point utterances. And again, the time spent in somewhat social engagement, so the time spent in the non-social engagement related to the frequency of non-social, so these 0 point utterances. So non-social being object engagement. So again, that's when you just played the ball. And essentially it's 0 point, you're labeling things. Whereas time spent in the somewhat social engagement, so that lower coordinated engagement, it has some aspects of coordination, but not that reciprocity and higher goal, was related to this somewhat social language, so 2 points. So it has some of the elements of communication, but not all of it. So for our limitations, as I mentioned, the sample was significantly cognitively and linguistically delayed on average. And we really think that played into our results. So as I mentioned, we couldn't examine the 3 and 4 point utterances because there just were not enough of them. And they spent very little time in both the lower and higher coordinated states on average. So we couldn't examine those relationships. And that is something I'm hoping to do in my future work, hopefully my dissertation, would be to recruit a sample with a broader range of abilities so that we can kind of measure those higher level kids. And then finally, while it may seem that a 10-minute interaction is brief and potentially not reflective of the child's typical language use or style, that approach is a well-established and widely used method in the field. Potentially going forward, I might try to get 2 interactions, but in general, naturalistic samples from brief interactions are effective. So finally, the clinical implications of this work. Our study, again, found that most of children's language was not used to communicate socially. And so we think this really points to a need to distinguish autistic children's social language from their expressive vocabularies, what you're getting from those parent report and standardized measures. That's great, and we obviously need to measure that. However, we also, I think, need to capture whether they're using those words integrated into social interactions. And finally, in terms of intervention, targeting social skills as opposed to just language skills or rote memorization and labeling may support social communication and interaction. And finally, I want to acknowledge that I'm funded as an RA with grants from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board Autism Grants Program. I want to thank Dr. Rollins for all of her guidance in this process, and Siddhi for being the best, and everyone else from our lab. And yeah, that's my work.